Although our guests this week are managing partners of a registered investment advisor, nothing in this podcast should be considered an offer of Multicoin's investment, advisory services, or should otherwise be confused for investment, tax, legal, or other financial advice. What's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Lightspeed. Today we have Kyle Samani from Multicoin. Kyle's one of the most independent and clearest thinkers in crypto. Kyle, welcome to the show.
Garrett, Mert, thanks for having me on. Excited to be early guest of the new Lightspeed show.
Yeah, we're lucky to have you. I want to start with one of the primary debates in crypto right now, which is modular versus monolithic. I know you kind of have a spicy take on this. What are your thoughts on the topic, and why do you say monolithic is a misnomer?
The correct term is integrated. If you have any kind of substantial understanding of the history of technology, like this debate has been had many, many times. Starting as far back as like the IBM mainframe, and like the reason that IBM was like, here, Microsoft, like, go forward, make our dumb operating system, is because like they thought the value of the system wasn't being integrated. And you've seen this pendulum swing back and forth at different layers of the stack. Obviously, in terms of PC components, you had Wintel kind of rise in the 90s, and then obviously iPhone kind of led to reintegration in terms of mobile context. In software, you've seen something similar. AWS started as a fairly modular platform and has slowly been integrating up the stack with PaaS and with all of their AI tools and whatever. And now they have a Mongo competitor and whatever call center tool, so you see this playing out in silicon. You see this playing out in hardware configurations. You see this playing out in OEMs. You see this playing out in operating systems and everything else kind of moving up the stack. The important thing to take away is not that there is a universal answer or a universal framework on how to think about which pieces of the stack should be integrated versus modular. There isn't an answer, because these things vary as a function of like different layers and how those layers interact with each other, and then they also vary over time. The most important example here being like Apple and integrating all the pieces in the iPhone together, and like swinging the pendulum away from modular components and towards integrated components, especially with systems on a chip and the full integration therein. So there isn't an answer to the question of modular versus integrated. It's just important to recognize that like this debate's been had many times, and actually typically both configurations coexist. Microsoft did not kill Apple. The existence of iPhone does not preclude Samsung from having a very large chip business. The existence of Celestia, Ethereum doesn't preclude Solana from existing, etc. These things actually, you typically see kind of both configurations coexist. It's pretty rare that like one kills the other. You have rare exceptions like CISC versus RISC, but like basically speaking, and that's not really integration versus modularity. That's just more of a question of complexity and chip design. But like these debates have been had. So that's kind of comment A, is like there isn't a universal framework. Comment B, and this is probably actually the more important one, is like you need to understand like what is the objective you are trying to achieve. In my opinion, like the customer of a blockchain is the developers, and developers want to build as good of applications as possible while doing as little work and thinking as much as possible. Both of those statements, or actually those variables, are gray and are multifaceted in terms of the inputs that comprise them. So you can't make kind of universal statements. But like one thing you can say pretty definitively is all of these modular things, OP stack, ZK stack, supernets, whatever, pick your flavor of choice. They are all increasing the complexity that developers have to think about across many vectors. Modular people kind of assume that that's isolated to like this vector of the security assumption between the bridge of the L2 and the L1. And that's like very myopic view of that, but it kind of fails to capture the broader social reality, which is like, okay, well, if your users have assets on another chain, are they getting over? What if you need to bridge out? Are there on-ramps for your new chain? Are there not? Are exchanges onboarding directly there? Like there's a limited amount of UI on the withdraw function of Coinbase. Like there's all of these weird things that emerge. Address form. I mean, apparently I learned this recently. Even on different EVM L2s, the address formats change across these things. So like the token contracts or whatever, like Aave is not the same on Optimism, it is on Arbitrum, and like that's a new form of social complexity that every developer and every wallet has to, you know, like you got to deal with all this shit. And so you just keep increasing this complexity in dealing with all of these problems. And I think that complexity is being pretty dramatically underappreciated by most developers in that world.
So you put it pretty well there, and you painted a very balanced picture. I would say the sentiment in CT is in CT crypto Twitter is very modular dominated. People seem to be like 80% modular bullish, let's say, and they see monolithic as a bad word, which
integrated.
Saying it shouldn't even be monolithic. It should be integrated. Why is that? Why is the popular discourse so dominated by this modularity talk? And how can what are your thoughts on how to fix that, or maybe make it more balanced?
I mean, just look at the market cap of ETH versus Sol. Like that's like kind of the simple answer. I hate being, I guess, almost like tribal about it, but I mean, I think that's basically what it is. Most people are just going along with whatever their bags say. Which, look, you can say the same thing about me. So maybe I'm the one who's not thinking. This is the thing that crypto has that does not exist in other technology markets, which is like you have public bag holders in very large quantities. Even when like the basis for which the kind of core business winnings, the traditional vectors on top of which businesses would win or lose, opportunities have not yet been defined. Typically, people become public bag holders once the major questions have been answered. And in the case of crypto, that's just not the case. And so bag holding effects are very real. In terms of how to change the discourse, yeah, I don't know. I mean, Justin Drake popularized the term monolith, which is pretty frustrating to me. I mean, he's a very smart guy. He generally does have a good sense of history. And you know, I was a little annoyed when he chose to use the pejorative term instead of the historically correct framing. Maybe the answer is to have a conversation with him and like, okay, like let's really dig into this. And like, you coined the term monolith versus modular, so like, okay, let's unpack it and let's have fun with it. I think that'd be fun. I don't get the sense you would opt into it, but would be pretty fun to do.
So while we're on that topic, actually, so the tribalism that you kind of, you know, the bag holder syndrome, let's call it, to label it, it clearly plays a pretty big role here. But it could also be used to bootstrap communities, right? Token incentivized communities, which is something you're very big on. So in that regard, it's like a double-edged sword. Like, what do you think it is? Is it a future or a bug? How can we best leverage it?
It's definitely a superpower. It's a superpower you need to know how to wield as a developer. Most developers don't know how to wield the superpower well. Folks actually like the Ethereum Foundation, I think they don't wield it particularly well or poorly. They kind of just treat it neutrally. Generally, I think the term community is used as an excuse for lack of thinking, and also used as a euphemism for or excuse for product market fit or lack thereof, depending on the context in which it's presented. I generally don't think community matters as a construct. Financial incentives matter. And like you can be very clear about how to think about financial incentives. I think DePIN being like a very good case study of where you can reason from first principles why those financial incentives should or should not work. It gets a lot more nebulous with L1s and other types of products, though.
So sticking on the modularity and the financial incentives, you see this with Rollups today with L2s, Arbitrum, Optimism, and doing airdrops, and that's how they're getting users and high TVLs. I know you've had a lot of comments on Rollups in the past. What is your bear case on Rollups, or has it changed?
I mean, I'm not opposed to the concept of them. I mean, look, they can exist, kind of, therefore they will exist. Like, these are permissionless systems. I think the right question is like, what is the right configuration of them? And I think it's kind of like, I'd say the Ethereum community is like hammer, everything is therefore nail. is I have a pretty high conviction that statement that's correct. And it turns out maybe like 5% of the things that people think are nails are actually nails is like probably correct. Maybe it's even under 5%. So they'll be out there. I mean, look, like at the limit, if you really push a system like Solana or like FireDancer, what really is the bottleneck at scale? Is it data or is it compute? I've gone back and forth with this on different people, and depending on which benchmarks you use, you get the different answers. My conclusion is I don't know. I don't particularly care, because the correct answer is Moore's law and Nielsen's law, and don't think so hard. But assuming the answer is compute, then you could get gains in total system efficiency by separating execution from DA. So like we'll see if that matters for scaling total system throughput. I'm pretty skeptical that delta matters, but potentially is a thing. And then maybe there are some developers, like maybe people come up with cool use cases that are still unclear. The most interesting use case for being in your own chain is a derivatives DEX. The idea of Appchains is not new. Obviously, Cosmos and Polkadot were the kind of two first people to push it hard. And I've spoken kind of every 12 months or so for the last 6 years. I've checked in with the Cosmos and the Polkadot people and been like, hey, like, what are the cool app chains? Like, what you're telling me it's customizable? So like, what are people customizing, right? And the only answer I've ever received that I think is even plausibly good is derivatives DEX. And that's because DEXs have a very specific set of parameters or properties rather that are unique, which is obviously they are money. I mean, that's where all the money is being made and lost. Obviously, you have HFT and latency and all that other shit. And then specifically in the context of derivatives, it's particularly sensitive. If people pay 150 bips on Coinbase, it's hard to argue that retail cares about spreads. And like you can make a DEX work with 50 basis point spreads. It's just not a problem. Derivatives are a little different though, because the people who trade derivatives are a lot more sensitive to those things. They're also sensitive to the Oracle and to the collateral management. Like it's just a 100x higher bar in terms of like median amount of caring about quality of execution in a derivatives DEX versus a spot DEX. And so there is a case to be made that by doing latency optimizations, primarily by centralizing the sequencer or pseudo centralizing the sequencer, you can deliver a Oracle plus collateral management plus latency set of optimizations that are impossible to do in a permissionless open system. And therefore that is the right way to unlock derivatives DEX. That is like a fundamentally viable theory. It has not yet been proven or disproven in either direction. I am of the belief that you can do it on a permissionless system. I think without question, you can get optimizations on a system like DYDX or Say that are not plausible on Solana. No questions asked. You can get to better performance. I am not particularly convinced that the marginal, basically, performance gains you get and spread reductions you get are like what are going to matter. But there's a chance I'm wrong there. Beyond that, I haven't seen any apps that like have been pitched that I'm like actually explain from first principles like why you need to be in a new place. I think a large part of the challenge in this discourse is that like the point of blockchains is shared state, and like shared state should be kind of interpreted as broadly as possible, shared between applications, shared between users. And this it kind of derives from like the core atomic unit of what do you do on a blockchain, which is like I have 5 coins and I send you 5 coins, and so my balance goes down by 5 and your balance goes up by 5. And like the fact that delta of 5 is enforced is the point of a chain. Whether the denomination is an NFT of n of 1 or whether the denomination is n of a billion doesn't really matter. Like that's the core thing that these systems are enforcing. And so the idea of app chains always struck me as wrong. I was like, not that there aren't apps and not that those apps can't be fairly isolated in terms of the types of states changes that they are doing, but it's like the point of these systems is that they're about shared state, and as long as you have parallelism per unit of state, then like what are you getting by going to a different asset ledger? Like I don't understand what you're gaining. Derivatives DEX being the very notable, interesting thing that is TBD. And look, maybe there are other things that are going to emerge that I'm not creative enough or just haven't seen yet because it's too early. But it's not obvious what those classes of apps are. Like that's for sure. It's definitely not obvious.
I want to tie two of your ideas together, which are really about composability. You tweeted like December 2021, I think, that 2022 was going to be the year of composability. And then you later tweeted talking about sequencers and how Ethereum, the consensus has kind of shifted from we're going to decentralize our sequencers to we're going to have shared sequencers. And with doing that, they're saying, okay, we're actually looking for atomic composability instead of censorship resistance. I'm curious, do you think, one, how important do you think atomic composability is? Sounds like you're pretty bullish on that and you think it's a big deal. And then two, do you think that's the right trade-off that L2 should be taking right now?
I think atomic composability is not that interesting. Even though my name is Composability Kyle on Twitter and has been for 2.5 years. I think atomic composability is useful for actually by definition the only class of user it is useful for are arbitrage bots. And they kind of define that broadly, whether it's DEX arbitrage or some flash loan, whatever. But that's not who you should design the system around. The system should be designed for retail, maximizing developer ease and maximizing retail access, and minimizing retail gas fees and latency. Atomic composability is intellectually cool though. When I talk about composability, I think of it really more broadly in the context of like, hey, one of the problems in all of these crypto systems is that like they are mostly heterogeneous above the asset ledger. So like, okay, you've got Solana or you've got ETH1, and like that is a logically consistent global homogeneous construct. And like everyone understands what the rules of those systems are and what the code is, and right, like it's the magical asset ledger in the sky, and it updates. But then everything else above that is heterogeneous. The exchanges, the wallets, the indexing and query providers, like the fiat on ramps, the currencies that you trade to get in, the geographic rules and regulations, like everything above the L1 is heterogeneous. And making all of those things work together across any arbitrary configuration of software and users is pretty complicated. It turns out that if everyone's using the same L1, there's just a lot of those problems like get solved kind of naturally-ish. And basically the L1 becomes a standard to which all of those other people conform themselves. And when you start breaking up into lots of small pieces, you have to get all of those players to reconform themselves around these different configurations of things. And the more configurations of things there are, the more total system complexity there is. And so when I talk about composability, it's not so much about atomic transactions and flash loans. It's about just like, as a developer, knowing you can like build a thing, throw it on the standard, which, you know, is ETH1 or Solana for the purposes of this discussion, and just know that everything, all the wallets will read and write from it correctly. All the exchanges will interface with it correctly. Whatever else, like you just know is conforming to that standard. And so you get the maximum iteration of compounding in terms of developers and users, instead of thinking about bridges and liquidity and on ramps and like all this other stuff.
So 2 questions there. One is you said that, in your view at least, the point of these systems is essentially single globally shared state. I think probably I agree with that, but I'm not sure if everybody would. So I'm curious to see, like, for people who just aren't familiar with this concept, why is that the point of these systems?
I mean, there are 2 kinds of software in the world: abundance software and scarcity software. The vast majority of software you use in the world is abundant software. like there's an infinite number of video streams, there's an infinite number of tweets, an infinite number of Telegram messages and Gmail messages and whatever. You can always create more content and just keep adding more and more and more and more and more. And that, like, the point of those systems is everything grows towards infinity. And then there is scarcity centric software, which is basically just the realm of money and finance. Which is like, I have $5 and I hand you $5, and so now my balance of dollars is down by 5 and your balance is up by 5. And something somewhere in the world needs to count the fact that I am down by 5 and you are up by 5. And obviously this applies for money, for asset. I mean, this just applies for assets, whether they're commodities, bonds, equities, whatever, it doesn't matter. And like blockchains are the kind of generic term I use for them across L1s and L2s is asset ledgers, because they're just ledgers keeping track of who owns which coins. Like, that's really all they're doing. Whether those coins are NFTs or whether they're fungible doesn't matter. That's what they do. And so, like, if you kind of take that to its logical extreme, the kind of obvious endpoint would be like, well, wouldn't it be nice if in the world there was just one asset ledger and like kept track of every, like what everyone owned? Like that's kind of the logical endpoint. Now there are political reasons why that won't be the case, and then perhaps technical reasons as well. But like, that's kind of clearly like the cleanest construction of the world is just one asset ledger that enforces those rules. I think you can get a lot more scale out of a single asset ledger than people appreciate, while still enforcing these social properties of blockchains in terms of Nakamoto coefficients as well as number of replicas and validations. I don't believe you need to validate these systems on a $200 computer at home. That's a very different thing to optimize for, which in my opinion is superfluous. But like, it's just, I mean, what's nice about physics in the real world is like, we have a common set of rules in physics, which is like, I have a green piece of paper and I hand you the piece of paper, and physics enforces that green piece of paper has not replicated into two pieces of paper, right? And like, that set of rules governs everything in meat space. Wouldn't it be nice if we could have the digital equivalent? One set of rules, or in this case, one asset ledger that enforces all notions of asset ownership around the world.
I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Permissionless. This is the biggest and best conference in all of DeFi. It's the one that we do with Bankless, who's a great partner for us. Last year, we had almost 7,000 people there in West Palm Beach. We are moving this year to Austin, Texas, from September 11th through the 13th. And if you are a listener of Bell Curve, any of these last 5 seasons, this conference is basically custom made for you. We're going to be talking about liquid staking, the theme of this season. We've got a bunch of great panels on MEV. If you listen to the Appchain thesis, we've got a bunch of Cosmos folks out there in full force. We're talking about the converging architecture of Solana, the Rollup space in ETH, and Cosmos. So I would love to see all of you there. And to reward you for being such great listeners to Bell Curve, you get a special 30% off code. It's BellCurve30. That'll get you 30% off tickets. Click the link in the show notes and then head over to the Permissionless site and make sure that you get your ticket today. Again, that is BellCurve30. Click the link in the show notes.
What is Solana's moat against other highly performant blockchains like Sui, Modad, other L2s that I just said, that are experimenting with LLVMs? Like, what is a moat in crypto when it comes to these L1s? Because at some point, you would think that the tech might become a commodity.
The state is the moat. Sorry, two things. It's the state, and then it's the integrations to the state. Obviously, if the code's open source, that's not a moat. So what is the state? Well, the state is who has how many coins. And so the more people who have more coins, like, that is state. And then there's not all forms of state are fungible for the purposes of the question you're asking. For example, an LP position in a AMM pool is different than just like passively owning coins, because that LP pool position is providing liquidity to other people to do stuff. But like, the broad answer to your question is state. And then the second part of that, which is important, is how many places are reading and writing from that state. And so that kind of means like on-ramps, applications that are, like Hivemapper or whatever, like Helium, like those things are theoretical demand drivers to create a lot more state on Solana. I think most people in crypto overvalue the total amount of state on all of these systems today by several orders of magnitude. And it's very hard for them to comprehend that, like, there is a world in which a asset ledger is like actually running at 50,000 TPS of demand, and like all of that stuff is happening around the world. And that is like, if you compare that to what exists in crypto today, like that is actually 1,000 times, like 100 to 1,000 times larger than what we have now. And it's very hard for people to grasp what that state of the world looks like. Because I think that state of the world has very little to do with the current state of the world, other than maybe some weird path dependency. I mean, there's some path dependency, obviously, but like that state of the world is very far away from the current one. And so I wouldn't overly project the status quo to that future state.
Yeah. And when you talk about state, how big of a deal do you think real world assets are? Like you see Solana making a push with the Saga phone. Like that's almost, to me, it looks like Amazon, who started off, they're just e-commerce, but they're almost building moats by having physical infrastructure that's actually hard to compete against. Like, do you think, I guess one, I'm curious what you think about the Solana like mobile push and how important that is, but two, just real world assets in general. Because to me, that might seem like another part of state that would be a big moat.
I'm very excited about Solana Mobile. I own a Saga phone.
Nice.
Here. I don't think Saga will sell in very large numbers, and I never expected it to. What's interesting about Saga is SMS, or the Solana Mobile Stack, which is free and open source and available to any Android OEM. And the hope always has been from day one is get other phone manufacturers to implement SMS. If it doesn't cost them anything, then the bar for implementation is not that high. Why might those people implement SMS? That's the question that needs to be answered. But like roughly speaking, should be those phone manufacturers. I think they can generate some revenue. So if you have some sort of app store rev share from the DApp store back to the OEMs, that's a revenue driver for them. And so the question from there is, well, are there apps from those app stores that are generating any revenue that can be shared back to the OEMs? So far, the answer to that question is there are clearly DEXs and NFT exchanges that obviously have trading fees that you could imagine flow back. None of that's happening today, but I don't think it's very hard to get to that world. I think if you went to Magic Eden and Tensor and said, will you take X% of your trading fees and send them back to Samsung or whoever, if you know that they're sending you that traffic, I think they would all say yes in a heartbeat. So I'm not too worried about the meat-based negotiations there. So the bet is, you can figure out a way to help these guys drive revenue from the apps. Apple and Google have chokeholds on their respective app stores, and the Android OEMs hate that and have tried many times to get around that and have universally failed. And so if you can have a new class of apps that by definition will not exist and work in the old model, and they can give some sort of rev share back, that's pretty interesting. I'd say I'm fairly optimistic that within a few years you'll see some major Android OEMs adopt SMS. It doesn't cost them much to do it, and it's it's basically for a close to free call option. And so that's kind of the big opportunity there, is distribution via OEMs.
So while we're on the topic of real world assets or the real world, or as you call it, meat space, I want to talk about DePIN, decentralized physical infrastructure networks. You're obviously one of the leading thinkers on this entire vertical, I would say. So actually, before we get into that, I think a lot of people, when I talk about this on Twitter, don't actually even know what it is. So can you just briefly explain what DePIN is in your own words and why it's important?
Yeah, it stands for decentralized physical infrastructure networks. The term was coined by the folks over at Masari. There are, like, broadly speaking, two classes of DePIN networks. There are ones that are GPS dependent, and then there are like server networks, which are kind of GPS dependent, but not really. So the simple way to contrast that would be like Filecoin versus Hivemapper. I'm assuming if you're listening to this, you know what Filecoin is. It's Airbnb for your hard drive in very simple terms. And latency to get around the planet Earth is roughly 100 milliseconds, 130 milliseconds to do one lap around the Earth at the diameter. So for like most applications, whether you're in New York or Chicago, doesn't matter. There are some class of application in which that does, but for the most part, it doesn't. And because human perception just can't perceive 5 millisecond kind of increments, again, for the most part. When you talk about HiveMapper, let's contrast, let's say Filecoin with HiveMapper. Like Google has several thousand cars today that drive around the world and capture pictures of the roads. And they use that to update their maps. Not only the shape of the roads, but more importantly, where all of the stop signs are, and the red lights, and the speed limit signs, and the yield signs, and the lane markings, and all that stuff. And having the shape of the road alone is not really enough to have a useful map. You kind of need to have all these other things to have a useful map. Wouldn't it make sense if everyone driving around the roads was just capturing that information and sharing it back and creating a global database of a map? And so that's what HiveMapper is. In HiveMapper, you buy a dash cam, you put it literally under your rearview mirror in your car. You drive around, it captures images and stuff, sends those up to their servers, and then they process it, and they do AI to detect the speed limit and the yield signs and lane markings, all that stuff. And then create a global map that's bottoms up from the people. There's like roughly 15,000 people who've set up a dash cam in their car now. They've mapped roughly 4 million road kilometers. There are about 60 million road kilometers in the world. So call it 7% or so of road kilometers have been mapped so far in about 8 months, right? So pretty impressive overall. Google, for context, is estimated to have about 20 million road kilometers. So they're 1/5 the size of Google, on obviously 1/1,000,000th the budget. So like what is DePIN? Sorry, back to the original question. There's two classes. There's the server style class of app, which is the Filecoin render kind of a thing. And then there is the Helium HiveMapper kind of a thing, which is very GPS dependent. Obviously, having a picture of Madison Avenue, New York is not equivalent to having a picture of Congress in Austin. So you need to get those things differently. We spend a lot of Multicoin is very likely the largest investor in both categories of apps as a function of dollars, and perhaps also as a function of number of names as well. So yeah, we've been doing it for a while.
Cal, can you touch on why you think it's important that maybe these behaviors that these projects are locking into are passive versus active? And that's talking about, for example, drivers that are already driving.
Yeah. The only way to make these DePIN systems work for the is like you need to have some sort of structural cost advantage versus Google, or versus in the case of, let's say, AWS, Amazon, or in the case of Helium versus Verizon and AT&T and T-Mobile. And like by far the easiest source of structural cost advantage is if a consumer was going to buy that hardware for some sort of personal consumption use case, and then they can repurpose that hardware to make it an income generating asset. The opportunity cost for those people, like those consumers were otherwise going to assume $0 of revenue generation from whatever the device was or service was, or time investment was. And now that number can be larger than zero. If Amazon is buying a GPU, like they are underwriting that, saying we're buying this GPU for whatever, $1,000, we expect to make whatever $10 an hour. I'm just making these numbers up, right? Therefore, after 5 months, we'll break even. Consumers are not running that math and are not that cost of capital sensitive. So there's a real structural source of cost advantage. In order to take advantage of that, you basically need to be able to have consumers passively offer whatever the thing is. So in the case of HiveMapper, it's like someone's paying people to sit in a Google car and drive that Google car around. But if you're driving from home to work, like obviously that's free. In the case of Helium, it's you're paying for your internet line at your house. And so if you want to be able to resell that bandwidth, you can put up a hotspot in your window and then resell that bandwidth.
By the way, I actually just coincidentally, I actually have a HiveMapper camera right here with me. So just in case people are interested, it's just I have one right here. It's
Love
a pretty
it.
sweet device. And the cool thing is, like, as a developer, you can actually plug into the APIs and kind of, build whatever you want with the maps and contribute to the ecosystem as well. I do want to, so I asked this question to you, I believe, on Twitter before, but I want to ask you here just so everybody's aware. And at first I was a little skeptical because I figured, okay, why do you actually need blockchains or crypto for this, right? Can't you just pay the consumers or whatever, the passive agents of the system, let's say, with non-crypto means? And I think you had an answer to this. I believe it might involve like the cold start problem. So can you touch on why crypto uniquely enables this?
Yeah. Actually, I wrote a blog post about this in December of last year. It's on the Multicoin blog post. I think it's called Crypto Payment Flows or something like that. If you guys want to throw that in the show notes. But to kind of recap that here, one, you generally need micropayments for these systems to work. When you're talking about people permissionlessly putting up their stuff, when they're spending their own electricity for these things, they need to be comped in not real time, but like something approximating real time. In the most generous answer, that's kind of 24 hours, and other answers, it's like every hour or something. And there's kind of different technical machinations to make that work in a trust minimized way. But you need to have lots of micropayments. And obviously, if you expect the supply side of these networks to be coming from hundreds of thousands or millions of people all over the world in very small denominations across many currencies and countries and geographies and banking systems, then like the only answer is blockchain. So that's quite important. And we see this already today with both Helium and HiveMapper. They're the probably two most at scale people who will tell you, like from first principles and experience, why that's paramount for their respective use cases. And the other one, and this one's actually less obvious, but arguably more important, is about incentives. If you are an Uber driver, like people talk about decentralized Uber, and like, what if the drivers had a stock in Uber for driving? There's that kind of class of commentary is not wrong, but it misses a more important subtle thing that is very distinct in Helium and HiveMapper. So in Uber, if like you're a driver and like, let's say you're the only driver, just for simplicity, and like a person downloads the app and opens the app and like calls you, and you go pick them up, like, well, you are getting paid dollars for performing that job, right? And therefore the demand side of the network, meaning the rider is happy because they got the ride, and the driver is happy because they got paid for providing the ride, right? And like that's pretty straightforward. But other classes of services require a minimum level of scale in order to function. So let's take Helium or HiveMapper. These are perfect examples. If you have a map of 500 road kilometers on HiveMapper, and let's assume you have like the most perfect map conceivable, whatever that means, just imagine it's absolutely perfect. What is that worth? And the answer is not Google Maps 500 divided by 20 million, which is what Google Maps has, or 560 million, which is the number of roads in the world. Which would be kind of the like very crude way to try and approximate the values, so to speak. The value of those 500 road kilometers is 0. And it's 0 because there is no customer that cares about 500 road kilometers. It's simply too small of a number for anyone to bother to get out of bed and care. It is unclear, obviously, what the minimum threshold is by which any given customer cares. I can tell you definitively 500 is too small for anyone to care about anything. Maybe the answer is at 1 million kilometers, people start caring. Maybe the answer is 5 million kilometers. I mean, whatever. There's obviously different thresholds for different kinds of apps. But the point is you need there are some pretty high minimum threshold that's required for the system to work at all. The same is true for telecom networks. A Helium network with 500 nodes is worth 0 because it's just not large enough for anyone to care. A telecom network with 1 million nodes is now worth something more than 0. Because you've achieved that minimum level of scale. What does this have to do with tokens and blockchains? You need a way to incentivize people for being early. The guy who installed the first Helium hotspot took on risk that the Helium network as a whole was never going to achieve a level of scale to where anyone would bother to use it at all. That guy took more risk, hotspot owner number 1, than hotspot owner number 300,000. Because if you're at number 300,000, you may not know what's the threshold at which the network is useful or not. But clearly, it's a much higher probability that it will achieve that threshold at number 300,000 than at number 1. right? And like that is the purest definition of risk, and therefore the earliest contributors to the network should be compensated for taking that risk. And like the simple way to compensate them is with more tokens. And there's different, obviously, mechanisms you can use for distributing tokens, miles driven, hours providing service, cover. I mean, whatever. There's those machinations vary by network type. But like you need to reward the people who took the most risk, and tokens do that very elegantly. In the case of networks like Render, which is about GPUs for machine learning workloads, there's another element to this that's pretty poorly misunderstood, which is that machine learning workloads and tend to be fairly lumpy. It's like someone shows up and is like, I have a job, like I need whatever 1,000 GPU hours to do the job. But then they finish the job and they go away. Maybe they'll come back in a month with another 1,000 job, but like they're not telling you I need 10 GPU hours per hour for the next 3 months. They tend to come in these very lumpy spikes. Now, as N becomes sufficiently large network wide, that all just evens itself out and it's fine. It doesn't matter. And you can just, you can model these things as being nice, smooth curves. But in the early days of a network, those spikes are a huge problem. And you can't model them as being a smooth curve. And so you need to have way more supply than there is demand in order to get the network off the ground, because no demand is going to show up if there's no supply. And so how do you compensate the supply for showing up even when there is no demand? And again, tokens are a very elegant answer to that question, as you could actually compensate the early suppliers in that way. And I believe that is like fundamentally justified in terms of building out the long-term network value of the system.
What do you think about the arguments, sticking with render and GPU? I've heard from some people say, GPUs are not fungible, and also a lot of the compute's going to be done at the edge, so like on your actual local device. And people point to things like Facebook and open sourcing their models, and you could actually run that device potentially in the future. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I've pretty high conviction views here, that this is like as perfect middle of the IQ curve as is possible, of a take. When demand for a service goes up 100x, 1000x over, call it a period of a handful of years, which is pretty clearly what's happening right now for just flops, just like loosely defined, it's very stupid to be like, well, this configuration of flops is not going to be able to service any of it, but this other configuration of flops will only be able to service it. And that's just obviously very stupid. The amount of time it takes to build a new fab is like 5-6 years with God knows how many $1 billion of capital investment. But like demand is up 10x in the last 6 months, and fab capacity is up 0x in the last 6 months. And so like what that means is all available software is going to slowly reconfigure itself to all available hardware. And the hardware itself will become more heterogeneous and is distributed in whatever ways it's distributed. And the software will configure itself around that so that you can attempt to try and get the markets to be as efficient as possible. The kind of classic debate, actually, this reminds me of, and I put out a tweet about this a while ago, was in the early 2000s, as kind of businesses started to meaningfully adopt computers for kind of white collar office workers, and like intranets were a big thing. There was a big discussion of thin clients versus thick client rollouts. And the thin client view was that like all you need at the desk is a keyboard, a mouse, and a monitor, and everything else can be living on the server. And the thick client view was no, like performance matters and people care about the experience, and you're going to have enough applications open that you're not going to be able to have a server big enough and whatever. And it turns out both of those views were stupid, because the answer was demand for total computational resources was effectively infinity and continues to grow towards infinity. And you there just need as much chips and as much storage and as much RAM as possible in like all configurations. And it was just like a stupid debate to begin with. And I look at this in the exact same way. All configurations of machine learning systems will exist. There will be stuff running locally in a privacy-sensitive manner. There will be stuff running on render. There will be stuff running on whatever other render competitor. and there will be stuff running in Amazon. And none of these will kill the others. They have different trade-offs, and different people will be optimizing for different things.
So while we're on the topic of hardware and meat space, a lot of people actually don't know that you have a pretty comprehensive background in AR and VR. And when the Apple Vision Pro came out, you had a really good thread, which I enjoyed. And I want to take this moment to maybe explore your thoughts on this new paradigm of spatial computing, and if you think it has any weight whatsoever or tie in with crypto and the metaverse.
The theory of crypto and metaverse being tied to each other doesn't have to do strictly with glasses or goggles. But the theory is, if you spend more time in some sort of 3D virtual space with people and presumably NPCs running around doing things, those systems will have economies. And if the systems have economies, then the question is, what rails do they run on? And like loosely speaking, there's kind of three answers to that. One is inside of a central company. Two is through the banking system. And three is crypto rails. And of those, the one that I find to be most elegant and palatable is crypto rails, but I'm a fairly biased party. So we'll see if that actually plays out. Obviously, there are some people who tend to believe that will be the case today. Look at kind of MMOs like EVE Online and Star Atlas and some others that are kind of moving in this direction, but still super early and can't really say anything with conviction. The relevance of all of that to Apple and to Oculus is like, is that 3D virtual world experience so much more immersive and compelling in the goggles form factor, such that you induce people to spend more time there, which therefore basically helps grow that economy, because presumably if there's more time spent, then presumably more dollars will flow through those rails.
And talking about VR, I think the two competitors right now that are out there are Apple and Facebook or Meta. Apple Vision Pro focuses more on like the personal computing experience, like productivity and home entertainment, and then you have Quest, which is more social and gaming. How do you feel about those two? Because there's that quote that says like, come for the tool, stay for the network. Curious, which one do you think is the right way to go about it here?
With form factors, it's a very hard problem to build adoption, and it's a thing Apple has a lot of experience with, both the desktop layer as well as the phone layer, and then the watch layer, and now the goggles layer, or goggles form factor, I should say. But the most instructive example for the purposes of goggles is desktops. So we got to go back to 1980 here. And in 1980, no one was like, I mean, yeah, maybe Bill Gates and Steve Jobs were like, it's going to be so cool for games. And like, I don't know, they got a Pong demo and they were like, oh my God, this is amazing. But like, I think they all recognized that like the first applications were going to be business applications. And they realized that because once they understood like this could be a lot of white collar office jobs could be made dramatically more productive, those companies would be willing to pay for the hardware and network infrastructure to get them set up and to train their people. And obviously a lot of those early employees were skeptical. They were like, what the fuck is this? And this is dumb. And I don't want to look at the screen and my eyes hurt and I don't know how to type. And I mean, like, there was a lot of friction that like had to be overcome, in 1980 for all this stuff to happen that we all take for granted now. But they did it because the productivity gains were incredible. I mean, and like, imagine building Excel models without Excel. Like, I've literally never done that in my life because I'm young. I'm 33. I'm like young enough that I didn't ever do that. But I actually cannot comprehend how to like do financial modeling without Excel. Like it doesn't make sense to me. Or like how to write documents without Word. Like I don't know what to do. And so that those are incredible productivity gains. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the kind of important takeaway is like, in order to bootstrap the form factor of desktop, you needed to identify the two use cases were documents and Excel, and then kind of email, which is kind of both of those things. PowerPoint is like actually 100x less important. But like the first app was VisiCalc and the second app was word processing. Those are the things that mattered. And everything else was a rounding error. And for phones, actually, Apple, funny enough, didn't experience this problem at all because everyone universally understood that the most important application of phones was first phone calls and then later SMS, but like getting in touch with your family and your friends. And that was universally understood, and there was no question about that, right? And the criticism of the iPhone was not, it doesn't make phone. I mean, there was a lot of jokes that like the phone calls aren't great, but like everyone understood it made phone calls, and like the question was, are apps useful, and the price point and all that, those other things. But it wasn't hard to get adoption because everyone understood, like, call your mom. And then if you look at the watch, Apple had a bunch of theories of if you go watch the first watch keynote, they lean hard into apps. And if you then look at the subsequent 3 keynotes, you can just see them slowly positioning away from third-party apps to basically health and fitness, and to a much lesser extent, like fashion design statement. And they realized that like this thing has one function, which is health and fitness. And Apple is now insourcing all of that into the watch, and they've just been iterating on that now for many years. But it took them a while to figure that out. So now getting to the goggles, or to Vision Pro, the question is like, what's the use case that justifies the new form factor? Which, like, and again, this form, like, no one was like, man, iPhone bad, like it's bigger than my Nokia brick, it's not going to fit in my pocket. Like, no one really said that. No one had a problem with the watch form factor when the watch came out. But the form factor people complained about was desktops in 1980. And like, there's so many great articles of people being like, workers aren't going to stare at this green, ugly screen all day. And I mean, shit like that. And obviously now the equivalent article is, no one's going to wear these damn goggles all day. And obviously there's lots of people who kind of think that. So Apple understands, in order to overcome those criticisms, you need to have a productivity gain that is so large that like all of those criticisms are irrelevant. And that's what Vision Pro seems to be optimized for in the workplace. And that's why they're leaning into their strength of saying, it's backwards compatibility with basically all macOS apps. And it's basically just the world's greatest monitor, like is basically the right way to think about it. And obviously certain, designers and architects and I don't know, whatever, graphic design, I don't know, like clearly that class of person is going to be the first adopter of this product, who's going to wear it for many hours per day. And then like the question from there is, how do you expand, from there into others? That's quite unclear at this stage, but certainly step one at this point is fairly obvious. The other bet that Apple's making is just like, again, it's the best TV screen you've ever had. And so they're going to try and, create some very compelling content experiences at home with 3D entertainment from like the courtside shots at the NBA and, getting Disney on board to make some stuff. We'll see if any of that is any good, or what's it called? Entices consumers. But like that those are the bets they're making, is just like the hyper premium experience for the person who demands the best. And then try and come down market from there. I have more conviction on the workplace side of that, at least for step one, than I do of the consumer side of the stat. But I haven't worn the things and seen the consumer experiences, so who knows? Facebook is taking the opposite approach, saying like, hey, can we deliver something that you want to play a fun game, and then we'll try and make it social? Kind of roughly seems to be the Facebook theory. I don't have particularly views of like how well it's working or not. There's a fair bit of negativity in kind of the mainstream press that like it's not working. I assume it's unfair because the press tends to hate on things they don't understand. But anecdotally, my views, I guess, align with what the press says, but I don't actually know what the data says, so unclear.
So I'm going to pivot topics here while we're short on time. You are obviously a very big proponent and advocate for first principles thinking and just being a contrarian, being right. Crypto Twitter is a very interesting place, dominated by discourse of groupthink and, let's say, peer pressure, but really it's just groupthink. So I have two questions. One is, how do you cultivate such a contrarian and first principles thinking approach to crypto? Especially, Twitter is very infamous for being very critical of contrarian folks. And two, if you could use that thinking, that first principles approach, what is the one product or service you would build in crypto that nobody's building?
I disagree with the framing of contrarian. I think it is not a useful way to think about people or the world. What is useful is first principles thinking. And I do my best to be first principles in my thinking. I think I don't know how to cultivate that other than try and do it.
I love it.
I mean, like that, and then like, you know, ask anyone who's been on our investment. Ask Spencer, ask Shayan, ask Vishal. They've been on the investment team for quite some time. Ask even the people who listen into our investment team calls who aren't on the team, like our CFO and our GC and others who, you know, listen in. And what they'll tell you is like, enough people have argued with me enough about enough shit that they have come to realize that they were not thinking from first principles, and like that has rewired their brain. So one path to getting there is argue with Kyle enough, and Tushar and others. So that seems to work on very small scale. I don't know how to engender it on a larger scale. It seems kind of sociologically impossible given my understanding of like broad information flows and human biases via low fidelity communication channels. So I don't know what the answer is, unfortunately. That was part of the question. What was the second part of the question?
The second is, if you could build one product that nobody else is building, what would it be? What is everybody missing?
I mean, this is kind of a non-answer, but figure out how to imbue some notion of financialization into a mainstream consumer behavior, or like to go kind of the crude way of saying it would be decentralized social, which I think is mostly counterproductive term. But like, I think it's very important for crypto as a whole to have at least one app that is like fundamentally social in nature, that like my mom will understand what it is and why people use it, even if she does not want to use it on her own, and that it is like, you know, universally accessible and understandable very quickly, and that embeds some notion of financialization. That to me is the most important thing. Obviously, many people today are running experiments on how to achieve that, from Farcaster to Drip to Dialect to a bunch of other people. And we talk with a lot of these guys. We're investors in a handful of them, and are continuing to try and refine our thinking on the paths to get there. But like that, to me, at the ecosystem level, it's not a question, is like the single most important thing that could happen. Because once you have a senator and you have a congressman and they're like, their kids use it, like the discourse completely changes.
But you have a take on ZK that a lot of people don't talk about. And ZK is used for privacy and proof of computational integrity. And I'm curious if you think something with that's going to be one of the next big apps, or is going to be leveraged for the next big app. And maybe you can go into the FHE, introduce that to people as well.
I'm fairly certain that any large-scale consumer app in the near term, the first handful of them, to the extent they exist, will almost certainly not use ZK, just because the technical complexities of introducing ZK are just so large, and you can't iterate quickly and do product experimentation, and just like ZK is, given sheer technical complexity, basically antithetical to like consumer product building. Not that that's like mathematically true. It's just practically true because of like how building consumer products works. So I think it's very unlikely ZK is relevant at all to anything consumery. So that's question one. Question two, I guess, is like, how are you thinking about ZK and privacy and proofs of integrity? I'll comment more on the privacy side than the proofs of computational integrity, aka scalability side. I'm fairly confident ZK is not the correct answer for privacy on chain. I want to caveat that with a couple of things. If you were trying to say, I can prove to you that I am 21 so that you can sell me alcohol, but I'm not going to show you my address on my driver's license, that maps to ZK extraordinarily well. I mean, that's like literally what a zero knowledge proof does, is that. So if the goal is to preserve privacy, is like proving something about yourself, that works very well. If the goal is privacy in the context of DeFi, so you now there's some sort of notion of shared state, and there's an LP pool and or limit order, doesn't matter, and you have people crossing the spread, and you have people doing interactions, and there's now math happening between people. I don't think that maps to ZK for privacy. The fundamental reason is in a world in which people are submitting ZK things to a blockchain to do these kinds of financial transactions, there is no notion of global state. And therefore, if there's no notion of global state, you cannot reason about global state. That was a fairly abstract statement, so let me unpack that. The simplest way to understand that is to just think about Zcash. In Zcash, like, what does the Zcash proof say whenever, like, if you submit I think they're called Z transactions or whatever in Zcash, and the proof roughly says there are some series of UTXOs that have been sent to my series of private addresses in this encrypted blob, such that the total number of UTXOs I have received is less than the number of UTXOs I have sent out, including the current transaction. Basically, you're just saying my balance is larger than zero, is really all I just said. But for the context of, defining a zero knowledge proof, that's basically what the proof says. Why is it important? Why, like, the reason I spoke about it in that way is because if all of those proofs are in fact valid, then you know that there will not be more than 21 million Zcash. Zcash forked Bitcoin, so it's 21 million supply schedule. But there's actually no way to audit the supply of Zcash and say, are there more than 21 million tokens? This has been a known fundamental problem. I'm not going to call it a problem. I'm going to call it a property of this proof design system from day one. And in fact, there was a bug circa 2019 or 2020 in which they discovered that there was a bug and someone could have been minting an unlimited number of Zcash in the encrypted pool. No one believes that it was taken advantage of, but it was discovered, it was patched and then disclosed afterwards by the Electric Coin company, which further highlights the fact that there was no way to audit the system from the top down. So coming back to DeFi, why does this matter? Well, if you can't reason about the system from the top down, then like DeFi at least DeFi as we know it right now, doesn't work. If you can't reason about the system from the top down, then there is no XYK. You don't know what K is, and therefore you don't know what X and Y are. And you don't know how those things move along the curve. If there's no way to reason about it from top down, then how does collateral work in Aave? Like it doesn't. And then collateral management, and are you solvent, and your health factor, and all this stuff. Like those concepts don't work when everyone is submitting a bunch of private proofs to the chain. Everyone knows their own view of what they think is valid, which is fine. But for DeFi, you need to also have a top-down view to work. And that like fundamentally doesn't map to a bunch of encrypted ZK transactions. Now, that doesn't mean it's impossible. And obviously, there's a bunch of people, Alio and Aztec and DarkFi, and there's probably a handful of other teams I'm forgetting, that are really trying to enable these ZK SDKs for private DeFi. But like, they're all dealing with this like very basic logic problem of like, how do you reason about the system? And like, I cannot describe to you in finance terms how to do that, let alone then translate that into computer science and code. And so I think that's kind of fundamentally not going to work. To me, the right way to get to ZK DeFi is just FHE, or fully homomorphic encryption, which literally means you just imagine all of the contracts as they exist today on the chain, but they're encrypted, and you can just apply all of the state transitions to encrypted stuff on chain, and no one can, and the validators don't need to actually know what any of the balances are to apply the transitions and run the comparative if statements and such. That to me, like, and the beauty of that system is the core logic of the system is preserved. And in fact, assuming you have an FHE'd VM, FHE'd either EVM or SVM, you would likely be able to reuse the substantial majority of code that's already been written for that new world. And that strikes me as like the right way to solve the problem.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think Mert, we can probably go into the rapid fire round as we close up. I do want to ask Kyle one quick question. I love your communication style. And I'm just curious, has it always been that way? Like, you're very direct, authentic, more so than most people are. And I'm curious, like, do you intentionally do that? Has it always been that way? And like, do you encourage people at your firm to do the same?
Definitely encourage people at Multicoin to become more direct and concise. And I think it happens kind of naturally over time. Uh, I'd say I've mostly become this way primarily because of writing. I was a substantially less clear communicator pre-writing than post-writing. Certainly, and probably Ben Thompson was probably the most important figure who helped me refine my own writing. I mean, I've read every single introductory article ever written without exception from inception to today. I've never missed one article. And he's had a big impact on me. And then going through your own blog posts and refining them. One thing I find that's it's very fun to do is, I don't say fun, it's very painful to do, is to go read your own shit from 6 years ago and see how terrible it is. But a better way to do that that's more productive and less intellectually painful is write something that you want to publish, you think is good, and then don't publish it, and then come back to it in 6 months or 3 months. And you're like, wow, like my grammar construction and was very poorly, was not concise and such. And after you've done that a few hundred times and be real hard on yourself, that typically helps improve. But it's a pretty intellectually painful process.
I also edit this podcast and I have to listen to myself afterwards. So yeah, that sucks. I know it's a good it's a good learning experience. So I'll look back in 6 months and probably be like, wow, what were you doing back then? But yeah, it's a good learning experience.
Yep.
I'm not gonna do rapid fire. I just want to ask 2 final questions. Very generic cliche questions, which I'm sure Kyle won't like, but number 1 is, you obviously talk to a lot of founders, especially in the crypto space. What is one piece of advice you'd give to crypto founders?
Don't listen to crypto Twitter. do what you think is best.
And what is one piece of writing advice you would give?
This depends on what your objectives are as it pertains to writing. If your goal is to, if your goal is to improve the own quality of your thinking, then you need cadence, or you need reps. So you need to set a defined schedule of writing X number of things per week. Let's just say X is 1, because you don't have the time to do more than 1. It doesn't have to be public, and it doesn't have to be published. It doesn't need to be publicly facing, but it needs to be something that like passes whatever you think the intellectual bar is for like intellectually interesting. And obviously that's going to have some context dependence depending on the nature of your business. And try and produce 1 of those per week. And it could just be internal, like do you keep to yourself, or it could be something you share with your team, or it could be a public facing document. But force yourself to go through that process of write, refine, edit your own stuff. And you just need to do that a lot of times.
I haven't been doing this a lot now, but when I was trying to write 1 article per week, one thing you notice too is you actually start noticing things. And what do I mean by that is like, you have to produce content that week. So throughout your day, you're actually going to notice events that you're like, hey, I should write about that. Or that's interesting. Or I should think about that differently. But Kyle, thank you so much for coming on. This is an amazing conversation. I recommend everybody to read all of your blogs. They're on multicoin.com. I'll put all the links in the show notes. But yeah, thanks again. This was a really great conversation.
Garrett Mert, thanks for having me on. Also, our URL is multicoin.capital. Multicoin.com is, I think they keep trying to sell it to us, and I keep not, bidding their stupid numbers. But anyways, thank you all for having me on. Awesome to be here. Excited to be an early member of Lightspeed and excited to see this thing go up and to the right.